What if the thing you've been calling laziness your entire life isn't laziness at all? What if the exhaustion, the lack of motivation, the dragging your feet through your day isn't a flaw in your discipline or a sign that you're broken, but a deep signal from your soul that something essential is missing? In a world obsessed with hustle, productivity, and constant achievement, we've been taught that our worth is tied to output, that if you're not moving, striving, and outperforming others, then you must be failing. But beneath that cultural noise, there's a quieter, deeper truth, one that Carl Jung and many depth psychologists have pointed toward for decades, that what we often label as laziness is in fact spiritual disconnection. You're not lazy, you're disconnected. You've been pulled away from your own essence, your purpose, your values, your vitality. And your psyche is trying to survive in a world that doesn't nourish the soul. This video isn't about fixing you, it's about revealing you. We're going to explore the roots of spiritual disconnection, why it masquerades as laziness, how it manifests in your daily life, and how reconnecting with your deeper self can reignite the flame you thought you lost. Because what if the antidote to your so-called laziness isn't more discipline but more meaning? We live in a culture that treats rest like a sin and speed like a virtue. From early childhood, we are conditioned to equate our value with productivity, how much we can do, how fast we can move, how many goals we can accomplish. So when that internal engine begins to stall, when the fire seems to go out and we find ourselves dragging through each task, the knee-jerk assumption is clear: I must be lazy. But what if laziness is a myth, a misdiagnosis of something far deeper and more sacred? Carl Jung warned against the dangers of conflating psychological symptoms with moral failings. What we call laziness might not be a failure of willpower at all, but a crisis of alignment between our outer life and inner truth. The exhaustion you feel may not come from doing too little, but from doing too much of what means nothing to you. Laziness then becomes a protective mechanism, a red flag from the soul that you are living a life disconnected from what truly matters. When your soul is starving, your body speaks for it, and one of the ways it speaks is through lethargy. You might think you're just unmotivated, but look closer. Is it possible that your life has become filled with activities, obligations, and even dreams that no longer resonate with your deeper self? In Jungian terms, laziness is not a character defect. It's the ego's attempt to silence the psyche. But the psyche is persistent. If your external life veers too far from your inner calling, you will feel it as resistance. Not the resistance that comes from fear of hard work, but the resistance that comes from living in a narrative that your soul can no longer endorse. The problem, then, is not laziness. The problem is that the ego has built a life that the deeper self no longer wants to participate in. Your lethargy is a rebellion, a refusal of the soul to be complicit in its own erasure. Jung believed that symptoms, whether they appear as anxiety, fatigue, or apathy, are not to be eradicated, but listened to. They are messengers from the unconscious, often carrying painful but necessary truths. When you feel lazy, instead of scolding yourself, ask what this lethargy might be trying to reveal. Are you exhausted because you're not doing enough? Or because everything you are doing feels hollow? Is the endless to-do list truly serving your growth or simply distracting you from an emptiness you haven't yet dared to face? In the absence of deep meaning, your psyche shuts down. This is not dysfunction. This is intelligence. Spiritual disconnection disguises itself as laziness because we don't have the language to describe what's really happening. A soul caught in a life that doesn't belong to it. The more you push, the worse it gets. Because the soul doesn't respond to pressure, it responds to purpose. Imagine a person who seems lazy from the outside, someone who can't get out of bed, who procrastinates, who dreads the work they once loved. But what if that person is not defective but disoriented? What if they are someone who has lost their inner compass, who no longer hears the voice of the self beneath the noise of cultural expectation? Jung would say they are not lazy. They are estranged from the sacred. They are weary not because they have failed, but because they have not yet connected with what truly calls them. This is why the solution isn't found in motivational hacks or productivity tools. It's found in reclaiming the path inward. When you begin to align with your true self, motivation stops being a struggle. Energy returns. Passion is rediscovered. The myth of laziness crumbles. And in its place, you find not a broken human being, but a soul ready to awaken. There comes a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when the voice inside you begins to dim. You stop feeling called. The fire that once animated your choices flickers out, and in its place is a kind of quiet, not peaceful, but hollow. This silence of the soul is not the same as calm. It is the absence of guidance. The compass spins, but no direction feels true. You wake, you work, you perform the necessary rituals of life, but inside, a vast stillness grows. And it's terrifying, because for so long you believed that voice would never leave you. The one that whispered, "This matters, this is you." Carl Jung understood this silence not as a void, but as a phase. A psychic winter where the soil of the soul must lie fallow before new growth can take root. When the inner voice goes quiet, it is often because something within you is dying. Some old identity, some false path, some inherited dream. The silence is grief. The silence is transition. Our culture fears this silence. It rushes to fill it with noise, social media, distractions, self-help affirmations, anything but stillness. But Jung taught that this silence should not be avoided. It should be honored. Because beneath its surface lies something sacred, the threshold of transformation. When your inner voice fades, it's not because you're broken, it's because the life you've been living no longer resonates with who you are becoming. The ego panics in these moments. It wants clarity, certainty, a path forward. But the soul speaks in symbols, not instructions. And sometimes, it speaks through silence because words would only limit what must be felt. If you can sit with that silence, if you can resist the urge to force clarity, you will begin to sense the contours of something new, a truth not yet born, a self not yet spoken. The silence is not your enemy. It is your initiation. Think back to the moments in your life when everything changed, not from action but from stillness. The moment you left a relationship, not with rage but with quiet resolve. The moment you stepped away from a career, not in dramatic fashion, but with a soft, inner knowing. These were not moments of noise. They were moments of soul. The silence you feel now may be the same, a signal that a cycle is ending. Jung believed in the process of individuation, the journey of becoming one's truest self. But this journey is not a straight line. It requires descent. It requires getting lost. And in those lost places, the inner voice disappears not to abandon us but to draw us deeper, deeper into the unconscious, into the buried material of the psyche that must be integrated. When the voice goes quiet, it may be because it wants you to stop seeking answers out there and begin listening in here. The modern world doesn't make space for the soul's silence. It demands constant movement, constant output, constant clarity. But your soul doesn't work on deadlines. It doesn't operate in bullet points. It unfolds like a story. And sometimes, the chapter you're in is meant to be unreadable. The voice will return, but not on demand. It will return when you are still enough to receive it, when the clutter of your life has quieted enough for its subtle frequency to be heard again. Jung often said that the psyche is self-regulating. It knows what it needs. And sometimes what it needs is a pause, a sacred silence, a moment of apparent emptiness so that a deeper fullness can emerge. You are not lost. You are in process. And the silence is not the absence of your inner voice. It is the space that voice is preparing to rise from. Trust it. Wait for it. And when it returns, it will carry the weight of truth. There's a specific kind of heaviness that comes when you no longer feel tethered to anything meaningful. You wake up and go through the motions, but your actions feel mechanical, devoid of emotional weight. You scroll, you respond to messages, you meet your obligations, but beneath the surface there's a haunting emptiness, an unshakable sense that none of it truly matters. This is not laziness. This is not a lack of motivation. This is what it feels like to be disconnected from purpose. Jung believed that human beings are not sustained by rational goals alone, but by symbolic meaning. When our lives lack purpose, true, soul-aligned purpose, we lose vitality. Not because we're weak, but because the core of what animates us has gone missing, and the culture around us doesn't help. It offers artificial purposes: chase success, be productive, look happy. But the soul doesn't care about appearances, it craves authenticity, and when that's absent, aimlessness takes hold. Modern life has redefined purpose in ways that leave us empty. We're told to find it in our careers, in our productivity, in external validation. We're sold visions of success that have more to do with status than with inner alignment. But purpose isn't something you chase, it's something you remember. It's something you reconnect with, not through hustle but through presence. Jung described the psyche as having a telos, a built-in direction, a deeper intelligence that knows where you're meant to go. But when you become disconnected from this inner compass, when you stop listening to your dreams, your instincts, your pain, you begin to drift. The sense of aimlessness is not a failure, it is a signal, a sign that the map you were following no longer leads anywhere real. The real tragedy isn't that people feel lost, it's that they're pressured to keep walking paths that go nowhere, simply because those paths are socially approved. Aimlessness often emerges when you have outgrown the life you're in but haven't yet found the courage or clarity to step into the unknown. There is a liminal space between what no longer serves you and what has not yet fully arrived. In this space, the ego feels terrified. It wants answers. It wants a plan. But the soul is not in a rush. It is patient, and it speaks in whispers. You may feel aimless not because there is no path, but because the next path requires you to become someone you have not yet become. It requires you to shed illusions, masks, roles you've played out of survival. The aimlessness is sacred. It is the soul's way of pulling you away from what is false. Jung might say that this is the moment the self is inviting you deeper, beyond the surface structures of your life and into the archetypal territory of true meaning. The old you is dissolving, and that can feel like failure. But it's the beginning of transformation. To reconnect with purpose, you have to slow down. You have to become curious about your pain, about your boredom, about the quiet ache that lives beneath your distractions. What is it trying to tell you? What parts of your life feel like truth, and which feel like performance? You cannot force purpose. You can only clear space for it. It often returns when you stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be real. Purpose doesn't shout. It waits for silence. It lives in the small things that light you up, that bring a strange sense of peace or resonance. It lives in the longings you've buried because they didn't fit the mold. Jung believed that purpose wasn't something to be dictated from outside. It had to emerge from within, from the dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious. So if you feel aimless, don't panic. Sit with it. Let the silence stretch, long enough for something true to rise. You're not broken. You're becoming honest. We live in a world where silence has become almost unbearable. The moment we're alone, the moment things get quiet, we reach for a distraction. Music, scrolling, streaming, talking, anything to avoid the stillness. But why? Because silence is where the soul speaks, and most of us are terrified of what it might say. Modern society doesn't just tolerate noise, it depends on it. Noise keeps us consuming. It keeps us disconnected from the deeper questions. Am I happy? Am I fulfilled? Am I living the life I was meant to live? When your environment is constantly saturated with stimulation, you forget how to listen inward. And the cost is enormous. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And society gives us all the tools we need to do exactly that: endless entertainment, constant productivity, curated identities. The result? A life full of sound, but void of depth. The noise isn't just external, it's internal too. The mind becomes a looping reel of anxieties, judgments, comparisons, and expectations. This inner noise is a byproduct of outer conditioning. From a young age, we're taught to suppress emotion, to perform instead of feel, to achieve instead of reflect. The inner world becomes cluttered with voices that aren't ours: parents, teachers, influencers, culture. We confuse the voice of the ego with the voice of the soul. And so we never stop moving, never stop striving, because we're terrified of what might happen if we did. But here's the paradox. Healing requires stillness. Reconnection requires quiet. The spirit cannot be heard in chaos. The more we drown in constant noise, the further we drift from the sacred. Not because we're bad or lazy, but because we've been conditioned to equate silence with danger, boredom, or irrelevance. Yet in truth, silence is where we begin to remember ourselves. Think about how modern life is designed. Advertisements screaming for attention, news cycles engineered to provoke anxiety, social media rewarding outrage and performance. None of this is accidental. A noisy mind is an easily manipulated mind. A distracted soul is a profitable one. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended. It numbs you not out of malice but out of economic efficiency. Jung warned that when individuals lose touch with the deeper layers of the psyche, they become unconscious participants in mass neurosis. And what is mass neurosis today, if not the collective addiction to noise, speed, and appearance? We've replaced ritual with routine, connection with contact, and introspection with information overload. The soul, ignored for too long, begins to atrophy. And the result? A society that looks alive on the outside but is spiritually starved on the inside. This is the crisis we're living through, disguised as normality. To reclaim your spirit, you must begin to protect your silence. Not just with meditation or retreats, but in everyday moments. Walking without your phone, eating without a screen, sitting with discomfort instead of avoiding it. It's in these moments that the soul stirs. Jung believed that reconnection begins with attention, real, sustained attention to what arises within. The sacred is not far away, it's just drowned out. And so the task isn't to find meaning in the chaos, but to carve out enough quiet to hear what's been waiting all along. As you begin to listen, really listen, you may find that the noise you thought was necessary was only there to cover the grief, the longing, the buried truths. And when those truths begin to surface, the spirit begins to wake up. Not because you found something new, but because you finally created space for what was always there. We all carry within us a hidden side, the part we've disowned, denied, or deemed unacceptable. Carl Jung called this the shadow. And despite how much we try to bury it, the shadow never disappears. It waits, silently, shaping our behaviors from the dark. We tend to think of laziness, anger, selfishness, or even desire as moral failures. But what if these were simply exiled parts of ourselves? The parts we were told not to be. The parts we had to hide to be accepted. And yet, paradoxically, it is this very rejection that leads to fragmentation. What we suppress doesn't go away. It becomes unconscious. And what is unconscious controls us without us knowing. The shadow influences our choices, our relationships, our energy. It's not the enemy. It's the forgotten self trying to speak through symptoms like laziness, procrastination, or emotional shutdown. These aren't flaws, they're messages. What we call laziness is often a sign of inner resistance, not to work, but to false direction. If your soul senses that the life you're building isn't authentic, it will withdraw its energy. You'll feel stuck, disinterested, confused. Not because you're weak, but because your deeper self refuses to play along. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Many of us are walking around with lives built on unconscious contracts. I must be productive to be worthy. I must be agreeable to be loved. I must never express anger. But when these inner rules no longer serve us, the shadow begins to rebel, not to destroy us, but to wake us up. That fatigue you feel, it may be the soul saying no more. Not until you listen, not until you reconnect, Not until you're willing to face what you've tried to avoid. The tragedy is that we often fight our shadow with more suppression. We shame ourselves. We force motivation, we mimic discipline, all while ignoring the deeper question: what is this resistance really trying to tell me? Jung believed that within the shadow lies gold, the creative, emotional, spiritual potential of the self. But it can't be accessed through avoidance. It demands integration. That means seeing the parts of yourself you're ashamed of, the wounds you thought made you unlovable, the rage, the fear, the grief. Not to indulge them, but to understand them. What if your so-called laziness was your soul refusing to betray itself one more time? What if it was honesty, not failure? Reclaiming your shadow is not a one-time event. It's a lifelong conversation. And the first step is to stop punishing yourself for being tired. The second is to start asking why. Integration of the shadow is a spiritual act. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. And wholeness requires contradiction. You can be ambitious and tired, capable and uncertain, loving and angry. The shadow reminds us that we are not here to be ideals. We are here to be human. When we begin to meet our shadow with compassion instead of criticism, something shifts. The weight lessens, the energy returns. We no longer have to fight ourselves to function. Jung believed that the path to the self runs straight through the shadow, not around it. And so, what you've been avoiding may actually hold the key to your freedom. The question is not, how do I fix myself, but what part of me needs to be heard? Because when the soul is finally allowed to speak, not just the polished self, but the full self, what once looked like laziness becomes a doorway to awakening. What if your tiredness, your so-called laziness, is not a flaw, but a signal and a sacred summons? In Jungian psychology, this is the call to individuation. It's not about becoming better. It's about becoming whole. Individuation is the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves, the persona and the shadow, the ego and the soul. It's the soul's journey to itself. When we feel emotionally numb, disoriented, or misaligned with our daily lives, it's often because we've drifted too far from this process. We've conformed to external ideals, productivity, likability, status, at the cost of authenticity. And so, the psyche protests, through burnout, through disinterest, through what we call laziness. But this inner resistance is not a failure of willpower. It's the soul knocking on the door, asking to be seen, heard, and reintegrated. The longer we ignore it, the louder the symptoms become. Individuation doesn't begin with goals or self-improvement plans. It begins with noticing, listening, slowing down enough to hear what's beneath the noise. For many, this feels terrifying. We're conditioned to fix problems, to stay in motion, to keep achieving. But individuation asks us to pause and face what we've avoided. Our real fears, our unmet grief, our forgotten dreams. This process is not linear. It's messy, non-linear, deeply personal. You might lose your ambition for things that no longer resonate. You might feel drawn to solitude, creativity, or spiritual practices. What the world sees as regression might in fact be the beginning of your true unfolding. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That privilege can't be accessed through constant motion. It requires descent, a willing journey into the depths where the fragments of your true self are waiting. When the call to individuation comes, it often arrives disguised as crisis. A loss of meaning, a career that suddenly feels hollow, relationships that feel misaligned. Even chronic fatigue or apathy can be part of this psychic revolt. The ego resists this change. It prefers control, certainty, repetition. But the soul does not care for comfort. It cares for truth. And truth often disrupts the carefully curated life we've built. Jung taught that suffering has a purpose, not to punish but to transform. What feels like a breakdown may be a necessary break from who you thought you had to be. In these moments, your soul is not abandoning you. It's calling you inward. Not to fix yourself, but to meet yourself. To begin a deeper dialogue with the real you. Not the socially acceptable version, but the layered, wounded, beautiful self that has always existed beneath the surface. Individuation is not the path of perfection, it's the path of integration. To become whole is to embrace paradox, strength and vulnerability, ambition and rest, light and shadow. This journey is not about fixing what's broken, it's about retrieving what's been lost. Your energy may return not through force, but through honesty. Not through productivity hacks, but through spiritual alignment. True vitality comes from inner coherence, when your outer life matches your inner truth. When what you do is an expression of who you are, not a mask you wear to be accepted. The world needs less hustle and more wholeness. And wholeness begins when you answer the call, not to do more, but to become more yourself. If you feel like something is missing, maybe it's not motivation, maybe it's meaning. And maybe the way back to meaning is not forward, but inward. We live in a culture that treats rest like a weakness and busyness like a badge of honor. From a young age, we are programmed to produce, to achieve, to outperform, to be useful. Productivity is no longer just a way to get things done. It's become a moral value. If you're not constantly working on something, your job, your body, your goals, you're seen as wasting time. But what if this obsession with doing is precisely what's robbing us of being? Carl Jung warned against the overvaluation of the ego, the part of us obsessed with control, results, and appearances. And modern productivity culture is the ego's playground. It rewards outward performance while ignoring inner truth. We hustle to outrun feelings we don't want to face. We keep busy to avoid the silence in which our soul might speak. In this race, exhaustion isn't just common, it's expected. But that's not a life. That's a slow, spiritual death dressed up as success. Soulful living, on the other hand, begins with presence. It's not concerned with metrics, schedules, or constant motion. It's about alignment, living in a way that honors your essence rather than exploits your energy. This doesn't mean laziness or apathy, it means discernment. Choosing what truly nourishes your spirit rather than what earns external approval. Soulful living asks deeper questions. Does this matter to me? Is this mine to carry? Am I living or just performing a version of life that others expect of me? Jung believed the soul speaks in symbols, emotions, images, not in spreadsheets and deadlines. And yet our world constantly pulls us away from this internal language, drowning it in noise, distraction, and performance. The result? We become strangers to ourselves. We achieve more than ever and feel emptier than ever. We've lost the art of living well because we've mistaken doing for being. One of the great tragedies of our time is that burnout is normalized. People wear it like a medal. But burnout is not a personal failure. It's often a spiritual red flag. It's the body and psyche screaming that something is deeply misaligned, that we've sacrificed too much of the soul for the sake of the schedule. In Jungian terms, we are caught in the persona, the mask we wear to fit in, and we've lost touch with the deeper self. This deeper self does not care how many emails you've answered today. It cares whether you feel alive, whether you're connected to purpose, whether your actions reflect your values. When we ignore the soul in favor of relentless productivity, we create inner fragmentation. We become efficient machines, but hollow humans. The irony is that true productivity, meaningful, sustainable, creative productivity, can only come from a place of wholeness, not depletion. The shift from productivity to soulful living is not a rejection of goals or ambition. It's a reorientation. It's asking, is my ambition rooted in fear or in love? Am I achieving to escape myself or to express myself? It means redefining success as depth rather than speed, connection rather than conquest. It requires courage, because stepping off the treadmill of modern life can feel like failure, but it's actually the first step toward freedom. Jung said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." That clarity doesn't come from hustle. It comes from stillness, from reclaiming your rhythm, from choosing to live soul first, not ego first. In a world that worships efficiency, choosing slowness can feel radical. But it's in slowness that you hear the soul again. It's in that quiet, intentional space where real life, not the performance of life, begins. Modern life often leaves us starving for meaning. We're surrounded by information, connection, and stimulation, yet more disconnected from ourselves than ever before. We chase productivity, success, and validation, but at the end of the day, something always feels missing. That emptiness isn't a flaw in your character. It's a signal, a symptom of spiritual disconnection. Carl Jung believed that a human being cannot feel whole without meaning, and that the soul will suffer, sometimes through anxiety, depression, or existential dread, when that meaning is absent. But meaning isn't found through more effort. It's not something we conquer or build through checklists. It's something we uncover when we begin to listen again, not to the noise of the world, but to the quiet wisdom within. And this requires a radical act of trust. Trust that the soul knows the way even if the ego does not. Listening to the soul isn't a logical process. It doesn't speak in bullet points or schedules. It speaks through symbols, intuition, emotion, and synchronicity. You might feel a persistent pull toward a path that makes no sense on paper, but feels deeply right. You might experience a dream that leaves you shaken yet strangely seen. Or you might notice how whenever you do a certain thing, writing, painting, helping others, walking in nature, time disappears and something within you settles. These aren't coincidences, they're clues. Soul speaks softly, but it's always speaking. The trouble is, we've been conditioned to ignore it. We doubt it because it doesn't sound like what the world told us success looks like. We silence it because its truth would require us to change, to let go of what's safe but suffocating. But ignoring the soul is never without cost. It is the root of our quiet despair. To reconnect with meaning, we must begin with stillness. Not just physical stillness, but inner stillness, the kind that allows forgotten parts of us to surface. In Jungian therapy, this might look like active imagination, dream analysis, or deep shadow work. In everyday life, it might look like journaling, meditating, or simply sitting in silence without reaching for a screen. It means creating space for what's been buried, for the pain you've avoided, for the longings you've dismissed. And as uncomfortable as this process can be, it is also sacred. Because in that raw, vulnerable place and beneath the armor of who you think you're supposed to be, you rediscover your essence. You begin to realize that the meaning you've been searching for out there has always been waiting inside you. It's not found in performance but in presence, not in answers but in the willingness to ask the deeper questions. Reconnecting with meaning also requires courage, because it often asks you to walk a path that others won't understand. The soul's direction doesn't always align with society's expectations. It might lead you to leave a career, end a relationship, move across the world, or simply start saying no to things that drain you. But Jung reminds us that the individuation process, the journey toward wholeness, is not about pleasing others. It's about becoming who you truly are. And that path is never linear. It's cyclical, mysterious, and deeply personal. Yet, the more you follow it, the more life becomes infused with something sacred again. Not perfect, not painless, but meaningful. You begin to feel connected to yourself, to others, to something greater than you. And in that connection, laziness dissolves, emptiness softens. What once felt numb now feels alive. That's not a coincidence. That's the soul speaking, finally being heard. We often label ourselves as lazy when we feel paralyzed by emotional numbness. It's as if the world is moving at full speed, but we're stuck in place, unable to summon the energy to engage with it. The pressure to act, to achieve, and to produce constantly surrounds us. In this context, the feeling of being lazy becomes almost a moral failing, something to be ashamed of. But what if the true root of this so-called laziness isn't an issue of character or willpower, but a symptom of something deeper? Carl Jung believed that emotional numbness often emerges as a defense mechanism against overwhelming or unprocessed emotions. It's not that we don't care or lack motivation. We're simply disconnected from the deeper layers of our psyche, which hold the keys to our true emotional vitality. In fact, what we experience as laziness might actually be our soul's way of retreating from an existence that has become too overwhelming, too disconnected, or too hollow. Emotional numbness often arises when we push our authentic emotions into the unconscious. In a world that glorifies constant productivity and outward success, there is little room for vulnerability, grief, or even joy that doesn't serve a practical purpose. Over time, the soul begins to lose its vitality, and the emotions that once flowed freely become locked away. But these emotions do not disappear. They accumulate, and what was once a healthy emotional expression becomes a heavy, suffocating weight. The body, the psyche, they cannot hold these repressed emotions forever. Eventually, they manifest as numbness, an inability to feel. This numbness can then give the illusion of laziness, the inertia, the unwillingness to act, the constant sense of being stuck. Yet it's not laziness at all. It's a form of self-protection. Our psyche is telling us that we need to address what we've ignored for too long. The reason we perceive emotional numbness as laziness is because we are living in a world that is obsessed with external measures of productivity. We're told that we must be constantly striving, constantly improving, constantly moving forward. But this doesn't take into account the internal processes of healing, reflection, and emotional integration. In the same way that a car needs to stop for fuel and maintenance, so too does the psyche need time for introspection, release, and renewal. But in our society, these things are often seen as indulgent or unnecessary. And so, when we experience emotional numbness, we push ourselves harder, believing that more effort will solve the problem. This only deepens the disconnect. The more we try to force ourselves into action, the more we distance ourselves from the root of the issue. The need to listen, to heal, and to reconnect with our emotions in a more integrated way. True healing, as Jung suggested, is a process of integration, of bringing together the fragmented parts of the self. Emotional numbness often arises because we've disconnected from parts of ourselves that we perceive as too painful, too inconvenient, or too undesirable. Yet these aspects of ourselves are not to be discarded or suppressed. They must be understood and integrated. And when we start this process, we may feel as though we're lazy because we are no longer able to push ourselves the way we once did. But this is not laziness. It's an invitation from the soul to slow down, to pause, and to allow ourselves to feel what we've been avoiding. The more we do this, the more energy and vitality we begin to reclaim. The soul, once ignored, begins to speak again. What we once thought of as laziness is actually the beginning of a profound journey toward re-engagement with life. But this time, in a way that honors our true emotional selves. As we've journeyed through the layers of emotional numbness, laziness, and disconnection, we come to the realization that the path forward is not one of force or willpower, but of integration and awareness. Carl Jung's work focused deeply on the process of individuation, the path to becoming whole by integrating all parts of the self, both light and shadow. This is the process of healing, where we no longer push away the parts of us that have been neglected or suppressed, but instead allow them to come into consciousness, to be felt, and ultimately to be integrated. Healing is not a destination. It's a process of awareness, self-reflection, and acceptance. It's about acknowledging our emotional wounds and seeing them not as weaknesses, but as opportunities for growth. It's through this deeper understanding of ourselves that we begin to move forward, not by ignoring our pain or pretending it doesn't exist, but by embracing it and allowing it to teach us. To heal through integration means to cease the practice of fragmentation, to stop compartmentalizing parts of ourselves as undesirable or unworthy of attention. It requires a courageous willingness to face the aspects of our psyche that we have ignored, denied, or rejected. This is where the true power of the individuation process lies, in the acceptance of the shadow. The shadow is not something to be feared, but something to be understood. It holds the key to our wholeness. As we begin to acknowledge and accept our fears, our desires, our traumas, and our suppressed emotions, we begin to reconnect with the full spectrum of who we are. This is a liberating process, one that brings about a sense of inner peace and balance. As we integrate the fragmented pieces of ourselves, we step into our true power and become more aligned with our soul's authentic expression. Awareness is a crucial component of this healing process. It's through awareness that we begin to see the patterns in our lives, the unconscious behaviors, the repeating cycles, the places where we continue to get stuck. This awareness isn't just intellectual, it's emotional and embodied. It's about paying attention to how our body feels, what our emotions are telling us, and how we react to different situations. Jung spoke of the importance of conscious suffering, the idea that we cannot heal without first becoming conscious of what ails us. To face our emotions head-on, without judgment or resistance, is the first step toward healing. This awareness allows us to move out of automatic responses and into a more conscious way of being. It also allows us to make choices that are in alignment with our true selves, rather than being driven by unconscious forces or societal expectations. The journey toward healing through integration and awareness is not a linear one. It's not about achieving some perfect state of being or reaching a final destination. It's about learning to navigate life with a deeper sense of understanding and acceptance. As we begin to integrate all parts of ourselves, our strengths and our weaknesses, our light and our dark, we become more whole. This wholeness isn't about perfection, but about embracing our humanity with all its complexities. Healing is about learning to be with ourselves, to listen to our inner voice, and to honor the wisdom of our emotional experiences. As we move forward on this path, we begin to reclaim our vitality, our sense of purpose, and our connection to the world around us. And in doing so, we heal not just ourselves, but also the world we inhabit. The path to healing is one of integration, awareness, and profound self-acceptance. As we wrap up this journey, it's essential to remember that the feelings we often label as laziness or spiritual disconnection are not signs of failure. Instead, they are the soul's cry for attention, an invitation to slow down and reconnect with what truly matters. Carl Jung's teachings remind us that healing is not about forcing ourselves into predefined molds of success or productivity. It's about embracing the parts of ourselves we've neglected and bringing them into the light of awareness. The path to spiritual reconnection is a deeply personal one, and it's never linear. It's a process of accepting all parts of ourselves, integrating our shadow, and learning to live in harmony with our deepest truths. As we become more conscious of our emotions and desires, we can free ourselves from the chains of disconnection and find meaning in the everyday. It's not about achieving perfection. It's about embracing the imperfection of our human experience. If you've been feeling disconnected, unmotivated, or lost, know that this is not your permanent state. It's a signpost on the path to greater self-awareness and healing. The journey to reconnect with your soul is not only possible, but it's also the most rewarding path you can take. So start today. Listen to your inner voice. Embrace your shadow and begin the process of coming home to yourself. Thank you for watching. If this video resonated with you, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share with others who might benefit from this message. Your journey toward reconnection begins now.